Hi and welcome. My name is Carol Simon Levin, and I'm going to be portraying Jeanette Rankin in my program Pickets and Persistence, War Service, and Women's Suffrage. And I think this is our special COVID-19 version, and I think that Jeanette would probably be very much aware of it because she lived through the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. In any event, let us get started. As I said, our program is called Pickets and Persistence, War Service, and Women's Suffrage. And it's how a pacifist, a pragmatist, a provocateur, and a reluctant president, along with the actions of millions of women in a terrible world war, accomplished something that had eluded the women of this country for generations: a constitutional amendment guaranteeing women, American women, the right to vote. And it's a right we cannot take for granted. So let me introduce the characters in this drama. The first one is myself, Jeanette Rankin. I'm the pacifist. Then there's Carrie Chapman Catt. She's the pragmatist. There's Alice Paul, the provocateur. And there's Woodrow Wilson, the reluctant president. And as I said, it also took a terrible war and the actions of millions of women in order to get women's suffrage, something that had eluded us for 7 decades. So let me introduce myself. As I said, my name is Jeanette Rankin, and I ran and won. I became a congresswoman the first female congresswoman in the country in November 1916. And you're looking at me and saying, November 1916, but women didn't get the vote till 1920. Well, that's true that nationally women did not get the vote, but some states were more progressive. And my state, Montana, we won the vote in 1914. And then I used it 2 years later. 5 months after I was elected, I and all the other members would be called to Congress, April 2nd, 1917, in a special session where President Wilson would have us vote on joining the Allies in Europe. And in the audience would be 530 men and 1 woman. It would be my first day of Congress, and that momentous vote would be in my hands the lives of young men and the hopes, ambitions, and fears of millions of women. So let's go back a little bit further now to Montana Territory, which is where I was born in 1880. I was the eldest of 7 children. I had 5 sisters and 1 brother. My father had come out as a prospector, but found real riches in ranching and construction. And my mother was a prospector also. She was a 24-year-old school teacher in New Hampshire who heard the pickings were much better for husbands out west and came out west and indeed did find my father. In any event, I grew up in the big sky of Montana. We divided our time in the summer between our ranch, and in the winter time so we could go to school. We were in Missoula. I loved summers best, never liked being cooped up. I called the ranch my thinking place, and we all did farm chores together with the workmen. I also was a bit of a seamstress, and on one occasion sewed up a horse who'd gotten too close to the barbed wire. I was as stubborn as the day is long. My mother once wrote my father, "I'll take care of all the rest of the children if you just take care of Jeanette." I also was a lifelong pacifist. I'd heard a story as a child of a young classmate of mine who'd been a baby on a wagon train across the country, and it had been surrounded by Native Americans, and the men had taken out their weapons, and his mother had shown his baby to show they were a peaceful party and they were let pass. And so I was always appalled at the senseless expenditure of human life, and when we read the charge of the Light Brigade, I pronounced it horrid. Well, after going through school, I enrolled at the University of Montana, which is a university my father had founded a few years before, and I studied biology so I could get outside as much as possible. But after I graduated, I found that a girl could do nothing with biology. Nobody would hire me as a science teacher. The only teacher I could get would be as a teacher for the lower grades in a Dane school. I was quite impatient, and I wrote in my diary, go, go, go. It makes no difference where you go, just go. Remember the first opportunity, go. Well, the first opportunity I had was when my brother, who was studying at Harvard, got sick. And I volunteered to go and nurse him, and I couldn't go alone. That would not be proper for a young woman, so I went along with a friend. By the time we got all the way to the East Coast, my brother was better, but he took us on a tour of the major cities, and even to Washington, D.C., where we attended the inaugural ball of Teddy Roosevelt. But what made the most impression on me was not the fancy ball, but the abject poverty that I saw there. The immigrant women and children in tenement houses, the sweatshops, the filth that I saw all around. And I wanted to do something about it, and I had heard that some women were actively organizing labor, in particular following the example of Jane Addams, who had started the Hull House, the first settlement house in the country. And that seemed like something meaningful that I might do. So I volunteered to go to a settlement house and work there in San Francisco. And there my eyes were opened to the plight of women and children in this country. Child labor, 14 hours a day in factories and coal mines and tenements. Women who had no legal recourse against abusive husbands. Married women were often forbidden by law to keep the money they earned or to own property, even if they'd inherited it. And in 23 states it was legal for the father to give away the child as soon as it left the mother's body. I wanted to help, but I felt I needed to learn how. So I went all the way back to the East Coast and enrolled in the New York School for Philanthropy in 1908. And there I found a woman named Harriet Stanton Blatch. She was the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was busy organizing working women and pulling together all classes of women, social workers, trade union activists, college-educated and progressive middle-class women, to work together to do what was called civic housekeeping, to clean up tenements, to improve factories, to make better wages for children and women. And I was really energized by this. And after that year, I went back west and I became a worker in an orphanage in Spokane, Washington. I had all these glorious goals that I would make life wonderful for these deprived children, but my eyes were soon opened. The orphanage was run by men who had nothing and no desire to know how to make it better, and most of the children who were placed were soon returned. And so I decided to go back to school, this time to enroll in the University of Washington to study politics and economics. And while I was there, I saw an advertisement in the college paper. They were looking for volunteers to put up posters for the women's suffrage campaign that was going on. And that aligned with my thoughts at the time, because I'd come to the conclusion that if we were going to have any kind of meaningful change, we needed to have the vote. Of course, this was not a new idea. It goes all the way back to our first founding mother, Abigail Adams, who said in 1776 to remember the ladies. She wrote a letter to her husband at the Continental Congress, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Interestingly enough, one state, New Jersey, did have women's suffrage from 1776 to 1807, but it was revoked, and it would take over 100 years to get it back again. Most people date the beginning of real work toward women's suffrage toward the 1878 convention in Seneca Falls, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton proclaimed, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." That led to a decade of women's rights conventions around the country. But that all came to a halt with the Civil War. The labor shortages and patriotism on the part of women had them volunteering to make uniforms, to do filing and record keeping for the government, nursing, of course, and of course keeping the homes, farms, and businesses going in the absence of their menfolk. And of course they expected that this patriotism they were showing and the competence would lead to greater rights after the war. Unfortunately, they would be disappointed. In 1866, the American Equal Rights Association was established with the goal of winning voting rights for both African Americans and women. But despite extensive state and federal lobbying by women, the 14th and 15th Amendments that passed through Congress and then were ratified by the states gave the vote to black men only, which very much concerned the women, because previously the U.S. Constitution had not had the word male in it. Citizen might have been assumed to be male, but it wasn't defined as such. Frederick Douglass, who'd been a big backer of the women for the past 20 years on women's suffrage, called it the Negro's Hour, said that Negroes needed the vote, as they were called, what they called themselves those days. They needed the vote because they had been hung from lamp posts and seen their children sold away. But Sojourner Truth, a black woman who'd been very active in the suffrage movement in the 1850s, pointed out that the Negro's Hour excluded black women. She said there's a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about colored women theirs. And if the men get the rights and the women don't, we're just exchanging one master for another. Elizabeth Cady Stanton fretted that if that word male be added to the Constitution, it'll take us a century to get it out. She would only be off by 50 years. But what happened is it split the women's rights movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony resolved that they were going to fight that amendment in court. And so a number of women across the country tried to vote in the presidential election of 1872. These included Sojourner Truth, a number of women in the city of Vineland, New Jersey, who had done a protest vote in 1868, and Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was arrested in Rochester, and when she went to court, she went up to defend herself, and the judge said she was incompetent to testify. This is a woman who'd been speaking on the lecture circuit, doing 300 lectures a year sometimes. In any event, she was incompetent to testify. She was fined $100, which she refused to pay. And for a variety of reasons, it was a different case that went up to the Supreme Court in 1875, the Virginia minor case. But the court that year ruled that the U.S. Constitution, as it was currently constituted, when it conferred citizenship, did not necessarily confer the right of suffrage. They needed an amendment of their own. And so, in 1878, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a number of other women would introduce the 16th Amendment, which was identical to the 15th, granting the vote on the basis of sex. She was very infuriated by, as she put it, the studied inattention and contempt of the chair of the committee, and that would lead to 40 years of reintroducing the amendment and every year having it tabled with no action. Incidentally, Elizabeth Cady Stanton would do her own voting protest in 1880 when, accompanied by Susan B. Anthony, she attempted to cast her vote in Tenafly, New Jersey, citing that Constitution of New Jersey from 1776. She was, of course, rejected. She also that year organized a nationwide petition to urge the political parties to support women's suffrage. That too failed. And she spent a good part of that decade not only organizing women's suffrage, but along with Susan B. Anthony and Matilda Gage, writing the history, the first 3 volumes of women's suffrage, right on that dining room table in Tenafly, New Jersey. Meanwhile, while that's going on, another group of women, the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was organized by Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, Antoinette Brown Blackwell, and a number of others, regarded the 14th and 15th Amendments as a stepping stone, and they were going to work in the states and territories to try to build leverage for a federal amendment. They immediately had 2 territorial successes. In the territories, they did not have to put this up for a vote of the male electorate because the territorial government, the legislature, and the governor could decide to do it by themselves. And Wyoming decided to do it in 1869. It's believed they thought it was a great way of attracting women. They had a 6-to-1 male-female ratio, so they thought perhaps if they gave women the vote, they might get a few more wives. Utah followed the following year with a slightly different reason. The Mormons were trying to consolidate their power, and they were polygamous. So if they enfranchised their women, they, our family will have 4 votes, and your family will only have 2. And briefly, in 1883, the Washington Territory had it, but it would be voided 3 years later over prohibition, which was going to be a problem all along. And in 1887, Congress would reverse Utah's voting rights for women over the issue of polygamy. States were much harder, and it was only in 1887 that the first state, Kansas, granted any kind of suffrage. That was municipal suffrage, suffrage in the local elections. And the Kansas state flower, the sunflower, would become the symbol of the suffrage movement, so the women's suffrage supporters. So that's why you see a yellow flower for them. But the lack of many successes, despite so many campaigns, and activity in women's clubs and in prohibition, temperance unions, meant that it wasn't tenable to maintain two separate organizations. And so the two organizations merged into the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890. And immediately after the merge, there were four successes in western states. Wyoming insisted in becoming a state coming into the Union with its women, go Wyoming. Colorado in 1893 would enfranchise women, and it was the first place in the world to elect women. And then in 1896, Idaho and Utah, which by now no longer had polygamy, brought in their women as voters as well. But after that, despite thousands of activists and dozens of campaigns, there were no new victories. There's a great deal of frustration. Here you see Frances Willard, who was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the national head, surrounded by people. She's this very proper, very educated, she's the head of a women's college, woman who is surrounded by her political equals, the people who have no say in government. These are rather bad stereotypes of an idiot, a convict, an Indian, and an insane person. But the determination was still there to their last breaths, practically. Elizabeth Cady Stanton would die in 1902. Susan B. Anthony in 1906. One of her last public statements was, "Failure is impossible." But success would ultimately depend on a new generation of leaders. Carrie Chapman Catt and Dr. Anna Shaw of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Harriet Stanton Blatch, and Alice Paul. So we bring back to 1910, and I see that advertisement in the newspaper, and I'm recruited by the College Equal Suffrage Society, and I not only put up posters, but I end up traveling all around Washington giving hundreds of speeches. I find I'm good at it. I combine flattery and humor and practicality, and I have another useful quality in an age without amplification. My voice could carry. And one of my classic stump speeches was I would talk about a little timid boy who asked his father if he was frightened of anything, a bear, a lion, a tiger, a wolf. And when the father said no, he would say, "Pa, is Ma the only thing you're afraid of?" And after that, I would say that you Western men are not afraid of your women, and you're not afraid to give them the vote. We were very focused on converting the indifferent and letting the incorrigible alone. We really didn't want to go near the whole issue of prohibition because we knew that would work against us. Well, after all this work, we won. Our final vote in 1910 was 52,000 to almost 30,000, and Washington, after a 14-year drought, became the 5th state. And for me, it was a turning point because I went from being timid about speaking to being very confident and a persuasive speaker, and even more importantly for the movement, which was moribund, it had momentum. So that Christmas, after the election, I was quite excited. I returned to my home in Montana, and I discovered that there was a bill in the legislature for an amendment when the next session convened in January. And so I organized a meeting of the Political Equality Club, and I asked if I could spearhead lobbying, and with my experience, they were very eager to have me do this. When I got to Helena, I discovered that most of the legislature thought that this was a complete joke. But I said, "You've gotten the publicity, now you have to introduce the resolution." And there's the legislative chamber in Helena, isn't it beautiful? Anyway, when I got there that day, I discovered that the legislators had turned the chamber literally upside down. They put the women in their seats on the main floor, and they retreated to the spectators gallery above. They'd also replaced their spittoons on the main floor with vases of flowers and charged every legislator 50 cents for this. In any event, though, I took it quite seriously. I made a speech, and I quoted Jane Addams, who talked about the fact that You say that a woman's place is in the home, protecting the health and safety of the family, but if we can't control the health and safety in our community, for instance, typhoid, then we cannot protect our family. I found that some legislators mocked me, but others were supportive, and we got a good majority, but not the 2/3 we needed to pass the bill. And I quipped I would have preferred the votes to the violets, but we were determined to return again in the next legislature 2 years later. Meanwhile, I was recruited by the national organization, and I worked as a paid field organizer all across the country on various suffrage campaigns. One of the ones that I worked on was California. It was a huge campaign. It was not the first time they tried, but they were determined with Washington's success to keep the ball rolling. And I moved all around the state. I joked, probably seriously, that I've not slept in the same bed 2 nights in succession. And I concentrated in the rural areas and the mining camps. You might not think that's fertile ground, but we felt that the cities were controlled by the liquor industry, and we really needed, if we were going to get it passed, we had to get our votes outside there. And we did pass it. It won by 35,100 votes out of 247,000. 1 vote per precinct. So anytime anybody ever tells you that your vote doesn't count, you can remember California. Incidentally, the whole time I was wearing the long, fashionable, narrow skirts of the day and my own homemade hats, and they quipped that suffrage needed to succeed so I could get a better paying job and be able to buy some hats. In any event, in late 1912, Alice Paul asked the national organization. Alice Paul had been from New Jersey, had been a social worker, had gone to England and gotten very radicalized by the English suffrage movement. She came back and she said, "You're too tame here. If you want to pass suffrage, you really have to take action." So she asked the national organization if she could revive their constitutional committee. That was a committee that every session of Congress had introduced the bill, the amendment, suffrage resolution, and then watched it been tabled and then retired for 2 more years. And she said, "No, we have to keep up the pressure." So to give publicity to the cause, she and her friend Lucy Burns planned a grand parade on the eve of Wilson's inauguration. And between 5,000 and 8,000 women from across the country joined this parade. And they were led by a labor lawyer from New York City named Inez Mulholland. And they carried the banners stating, "Give women the vote." And here you can see everybody lined up. We joined, a delegation from Montana joined. We were dressed as Indians, led by Sacagawea, who was a symbol to the suffrage movement because she was considered the first woman to have a vote in a federal project, the Lewis and Clark expedition. But nobody knew who we were because our banners didn't arrive in time. What did arrive were lots and lots of hostile crowds. It's estimated, as I said, that there were somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 marchers and 500,000 spectators. And they quickly broke through the rope lines, and they heckled, tripped, showered the marchers with abuse. The police stood by. They didn't do anything to protect the marchers. Ambulances had to squeeze through. Some women were hospitalized. But the result was that the parade gained national attention, which very much pleased Alice Paul. As for me, I returned to state organizing, including gathering petition signatures from all over the country for another Alice Paul action. And in June 1913, I, joined by my friend Mary Land, drove 3 weeks across the country in a very primitive automobile, by your standards in any event. It was hand cranked. It had tires that regularly needed to be replaced. And of course, the roads were terrible as well. In any event, I joined Maryland, and I drove across country to Maryland to join 72 cars from around the country in a procession to Capitol Hill. Sadly, it made absolutely no difference to Congress. I returned in 1914 to Montana because the legislature had passed a state suffrage amendment, and it was time to convince the voters. And I went all out along with many, many other people. I personally traveled over 6,000 miles in every vehicle possible, including, of course, trains and cars and horse, but also one of those, have you ever seen those little up and down train things that go on a track? I did that once too to get there. In any event, if you were going to see me, you would see a poster beforehand that said, "Stop, look, listen, provided you are a live one. If dead already, stay where you are and be run over by the Suffrage Express that will overtake the fast mail at the Missoula Theater. Miss Jeanette Rankin of the greatest city on earth will act as engineer and discourse eloquently on the latest agricultural stunt to making 2 votes grow where 1 grew before. Have your life insured and bring your firearms, for there are going to be many bombs exploded and many balloons punctured." After World War I broke out in July, I also used another argument that if women had the vote, we would never, ever go to war, because we would never allow our product to go to war, our sons. The day of the election was nail-biting. It was a tight race. We didn't know how it was going to go, and we were afraid of election fraud. We had stationed poll watchers and were terribly worried when we heard they had been told to go home. But we quickly got them replaced, and the count did go in our favor, 41,000 to 37,000. We became the 11 states and 1 territory to have votes for women. The whole West had it. Now, we wanted to try for the East. The next few years, the national organization worked with the state organizations to get the legislatures in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, and Massachusetts, the places where suffrage had gotten its start so many years ago, to pass suffrage resolutions in those states. And by 1915, they had gotten through their legislatures and they were finally going to voters. Our goal was to at least get one of them to have leverage for the national amendment. But by then I was exhausted. I've been campaigning virtually nonstop for the past 4 years. I went home for surgery in Seattle and then decided instead of going to a Montana winter to recover, I would go to New Zealand, which was the first place in the world to have women's suffrage, and see what they'd been doing with it. They'd gotten it in 1893. While I was there, I worked as a seamstress to support myself, and I doubled the going rate by saying that I knew the latest American fashion, and then I taught all the local seamstresses, and they got a good rate too. While I was gone, the campaign was in full force. The slogan was "Victory in 1915." Lots of symbols. A torch of victory went across the Hudson River. There was a Liberty Bell that went all across Pennsylvania. There were endorsements from all sorts of organizations, including religious organizations. There were attempts at persuasion, advertisements talking about what women would do, that we need the laws to keep our families safe. All the things that women are able to do in the workforce, why can't they cast a ballot? But our opposition was very well funded. The antis were strong. There was money from the liquor interests, which feared prohibition, from manufacturing, which feared labor laws would be strengthened, from political parties, which feared that we would be too honest, we wouldn't be as easily persuadable by a chit for liquor, and even women who said, "Oh, it is so unladylike to vote." Alistair Miller, who was a wonderful writer, published poems and parodies in newspapers, and one of hers was "Why We Oppose Pockets for Women," and she used the same arguments that were being used against the vote. Because men are men and women are women, we must not fly in the face of nature. And because pockets have been used by men to carry tobacco, pipes, whiskey, flax, chewing gum, and compromising letters, we see no reason to suppose that women would use them more wisely. There's a great deal of frustration. A female college president had fewer political rights than her janitor, an ex-convict, an immigrant who spoke no English, illiterate man who couldn't read the ballot to vote. But our hopes were dashed. All 4 states failed to get enough male votes. President Wilson, who we had been trying to get to support it, ultimately voted for suffrage in the New Jersey election. That was the state he was a citizen of, but he would not publicly support it. And neither of the main political parties would support the amendment. And for New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, it would be another 5 years before they could try again. But there wasn't that prohibition on New York, and Carrie Chapman Catt, the new leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, said the very next day they were going to start to work on the 1917 election. Roll up your sleeves. But what happened was that the movement split again, because Alice Paul viewed the defeat of all four of those Eastern referenda as saying, no more. This is a waste of time to spend our time on the state referenda for the vote. And she said, we have to focus all our energies on the national amendment, and we have to start punishing our representatives and senators and the president for not supporting it. And so the summer of 1916, she created the National Women's Party and urged women in the states where they had the vote to vote against all Democrats who were in the majority in both the president and in Congress, as a way of flexing their power. Now, this was a very problematic view for the mainstream movement headed by Carrie Chapman Catt, because we had people supporting us and going against us in both the Democratic and the Republican Party. So there was a real feeling that that we would alienate our friends by doing this. And instead, at the National Convention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in Atlantic City that summer, Carrie Chapman Catt launched her winning plan. And the idea was that she'd have a different strategy for each state depending on whether they had the possibility of having a campaign or not. But the big idea would be to support pro-suffrage candidates in either party, and to try to get both political parties to support suffrage in their national platforms. And it was into this that I returned in the spring of 1916. I was reinvigorated and ready to go, and I had what a lot of people thought was a totally crazy idea. I decided I wanted to run for office. I didn't get a lot of support from the national organization. They thought it would be too risky, but I thought it was an opportune time because Montana was in this odd situation where they had we'd gotten a second representative, but it hadn't yet split into two districts, so everybody would be voting for two at-large representatives. And my brother Wellington, who I thought was very politically savvy, said that he would be my campaign manager, and we still had a lot of the structure in place from the 1914 suffrage campaign. And it didn't hurt that I thought that having a woman in Congress might help get the suffrage amendment moving again. So I ran for office. I ran as a progressive Republican, but I was never very tied to either party. My strategy was more nonpartisan. I said, vote for your local representative and vote for me. And I ran on a platform that recognized what women needed, especially women's suffrage, and then the interests of children. I was appalled that the previous Congress had allocated $300,000 for study of pig feed and $30,000 for the needs of children. And I also very much wanted us to be prepared for peace and defense, but not go to war. Election day came around in November of 1916, and our strategy won. I came in second to the incumbent Democrat, and it was very much thanks to the newly enfranchised Montana women. One wrote that she was 8 months pregnant when she rode 14 miles on a cold winter day, and I mean rode like on a horse, and would gladly do it again. Rumors were flying all over the country. People thought I was a freak. They were saying I had 6 shooters on my hips. I never owned a gun. During the 1914 Montana campaign, I had said if they were going to have a war, they should take the old man and leave the young to propagate the race, and people were horrified that an unmarried woman would talk about such things. Paper talked about me as a gray-eyed, slender girl with the enthusiasm of a zealot, the simplicity of a child, and the energy and fire of a racehorse. They also quoted me as saying that that I had no compromise when it was a question of principle, as you will see. In any event, around the country, people were fascinated. A toothpaste company offered me $5,000 for a picture of my teeth in their ads. I also had offers of a free car and marriage. I turned those down. But I did capitalize on the curiosity, and I went on a lecture tour. I spoke before over 3,000 people in Carnegie Hall, and I got $250 for that speech, which, in addition to my $7,500 congressional salary, which was quite a lot, my brother remarked, "That's a lot of money for a girl from the country." The new term of Congress was not expected to start till December of 1917, but the roar of the war made things happen early, and we were called into D.C. for a special session on April 2nd, 1917. And a couple of days before that session, the Suffragist, which was the newsletter that was being published by Alice Paul and her National Women's Party, published this wonderful cartoon by Nina Allender. It's a Come to Mother, and that is the Susan B. Anthony Amendment coming to me. She needs a woman to look after her. So April 2nd dawned, and the morning of that session, there was a celebratory breakfast, and I was sitting between Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, two people and their organizations which were very much divided over tactics, money. They had strong personal conflicts, and they were both on very different sides of the war issue. Many women were wearing white armbands. They were against going into the war. There was a lot of polite conversation, but the war was the big elephant in the room. Carrie Chapman Catt urged me to vote a man's vote for the war. Alice Paul, who's a Quaker and a pacifist, urged me to vote my conscience. After breakfast, there was a 25-car cavalcade to the Capitol with thousands of women lining Pennsylvania Avenue. And then when we arrived at Congress and entered the hall, it was very gratifying that my fellow congressmen got up and clapped and cheered. Women filled the gallery for the first order of business, the same first order of business that happened so many times before, the introduction of the federal suffrage amendment, which was, as always, sent to committee. But that evening, in a joint session, the mood turned serious as President Wilson asked for a declaration of war against Germany, citing the invasion of Belgium, U-boat loss of lives at sea, and the determination of the Kaiser to conquer his neighbors. And he argued we needed to go to war for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments and to make the world safe for democracy. But everybody wondered, would women support this? Because the U.S. had been officially neutral, and many women had been very active in the peace movement. In fact, many of the names I've mentioned before, Jane Addams, Carrie Chapman Catt, in the suffrage movement were also part of this Women's Peace Party and had made a delegation to Europe to try to get them to end the war after the first year of fighting and over 1 million dead, but military leaders refused to listen to them. But things were changing, especially with the U-boats at sea and the sinking of the Lusitania. We had been giving money and material support, but there was more of an urge. And then in March of 1917, when the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany was offering Mexico its lost territories if it came in against us in the war, that really turned the tide. And Americans were enraged, and so that led to President Wilson calling this special session. As for me, I was heartsick and very deeply troubled. This was the beginning of my congressional career, and everything I cared about was at stake: women's protection, suffrage. The vote in the Senate was very quick and overwhelmingly for the war, 82-6. But there was a lot of debate and discussion and dissension in the House of Representatives. Even Wilson's, the head of the House, Wilson's, was of the same party as Wilson. He was against it. And I had a lot of mail and a lot of visits and a lot of pressure saying I shouldn't stand out. The first woman in Congress should not make a different vote. But when the roll call finally came in at 3 in the morning on Good Friday, April 6, 1917, I said, I vote no. I want to stand by my country, but I cannot vote for war. And I was not alone in that. 49 other people voted against it as well, representatives. But it was my vote that made the national headlines. I was called a weak woman in the press. My letters from Montana, my correspondence was much different. My mail ran 16-1 against going to war. They very much feared being cannon fodder for Eastern bankers. We don't really know how the whole country felt. There were no polls in the day. In any event, after the war was approved, I did support Liberty Bonds and the draft, but I voted against the War Espionage Act. I felt that war destroyed everything women made, and war destroyed democracy. Carrie Chapman Catt very much went in support of Wilson's war, and she thought that the proof of patriotism would be critical to advancing suffrage, and she encouraged the women in the national organization to pitch in and get involved in the nation. But she also had learned from the Civil War and said, we're not stopping our advocacy for suffrage during this time. And around the country, women mobilized. They became farmerettes. College and city girls went out into plant and harvest. They worked in factories. A critical labor shortage already existed because so many immigrants were not coming during the war years. The male workers opposed women entering the factories because they feared that if women took jobs, the wages would go down. Their unions had not been supporting women workers in the past. So the Women's Trade Union League said, well, we'll have to support ourselves. And they said that they would encourage women to work in factories, but only if Congress adopted a minimum age of 14, disallowed tenement piecework, made fair wages for females, equal work for males and females doing the same work, and workplace safety inspections. And Congress, needing these women working, did support this legislation, although it wasn't always enforced. And women were thrilled. They were suddenly able to do so many other jobs. And while some of this was heavy lifting, housework was not like work in those days either. And they loved being treated well and appreciated as men. And as the demand increased, wages went up, and many secretaries and telephone operators ended up taking industrial jobs. And the bosses had to emphasize the value of their work, and women gained self-esteem. It also led to a black migration from the South to the better paying jobs up north, over 500,000 people. And of course, women also went overseas to the front. They served as drivers, very dangerous work, dodging shrapnel. The woman who was afraid to go out after dark to mail a letter may have a granddaughter who's on her way to France to drive an ambulance. Women became nurses, 21,000 volunteers in the Army, 1,200 in the Navy. Very dangerous work, 400 died in the war. But the desperate need for medics did not overcome discrimination. The Army and Navy refused black nurses and also female doctors. The National American Women's Suffrage Association and women's colleges raised money and outfitted 2 field hospitals staffed by women doctors. But then when they tried to give them to the War Department refused to give women, the doctors, officer status, which would have made it impossible for them to order around an orderly. So instead, those 2 hospitals were donated to the French, who had no such problems with that. And the Red Cross would eventually hire black nurses, but only once the so-called Spanish flu started and they were desperate. There was also individual initiative. A suffragist named Mary Borden outfitted her own mobile field hospital and ended up getting the French Croix de Guerre for her work. An artist headed overseas to paint masks and faces so that they could replace the parts of the faces that were lost as the soldiers went over the tops in the trenches. And women everywhere on the home front chipped in as well, saving, sewing, knitting, working in canteens, and making it possible for the war to continue in Europe. But the military discovered they had a big problem, and that was that with all the paperwork of all these new soldiers and sailors, they had nobody to keep track. And the typists were leaving for better jobs in the private sector, in industry. So Secretary of the Navy, Joseph Daniels, asked his aides, is there any regulation which specifies that a Navy yeoman be a man? When told not, he started hiring yeomanettes. And they were not necessarily popular with the sailors. Petticoats in the Navy, damned outrage, hell of a mess, back to sea for me, said one. But they worked very well, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they earned respect. And they soon were doing things like translation, switchboard electricians, and recruiting as well. So I'm going to skip that. The Army had an even greater need, but their regulations said only men could be soldiers. So General Pershing did a workaround. He instructed the Army Signal Corps, which was had previously hired civilians, to recruit bilingual female telephone operators because the men weren't cutting it. They didn't have enough people who spoke French or could be as good as switchboard operators as the women who had a lot of practice. 223 eventually served overseas. You can see them here. They're 1 to 2 miles from the front with their helmets and their gas masks. And they were sworn in, they had officer rank and so forth, and they were gallantly praised. And one of my fellow Montanans, Merle Egan, was sent to France, and she eventually rose up to become the highest switchboard operator, hello girl as they were called, and served as the chief operator in the armistice negotiations in November, handling calls from the president and the other leaders. But we eventually learned about the workaround consequences, because after the war, while they were highly praised, they didn't get any medals, and it turned out they didn't get any benefits as well, and it took 60 years of advocacy before they finally got the recognition they deserved in 1977, at the same time that the women Air Force Service pilots did, and only 18 of them were still alive. There's a wonderful book about them, the Hello Girls, and a terrific musical that you can find online called The Hello Girls. As for me, on the home front, I discovered, or I was told, that the government was abusing the women who were making the Liberty Bond, printing the Liberty Bond, Liberty Bonds. They were supposed to be limited to an 8-hour day, but instead they were working to up to 15 hours a day and falling down with exhaustion. I went undercover with a group of tourists, and then I hired a private detective who confirmed this. And I told the bureau director that if he didn't clean up his act, I was going to start a formal congressional investigation of this, and we were able to make the situation better for the workers. But unfortunately, all the other things that I wanted to do were sidelined because of the war. I'd wanted equal wages. I'd wanted pensioning of families of soldiers. I wanted women to be able to get citizenship independent of their husbands, because if you married a foreigner and then he died, you were stateless. I had a bill named after me, the Rankin-Robinson Bill for maternity and child hygiene, because 250,000 children died every year in America. We had the worst child health, worst rate of death in the world among so-called civilized nations. But it was called Bolshevik, this idea of protecting women and children's health. And they were shocked when I talk about contraception. But in any event, my primary goal, and the one I kept working on, was to try to pass the federal suffrage amendment. Immediately after being sworn in, I'd introduced that resolution, and it had been, as always, tabled. But I kept working on it behind the scenes. Meanwhile, outside, Alice Paul was making a ruckus. Alice Paul had been very frustrated by President Wilson's inaction on the amendment, and despite her attempt to get him voted out of office, he had been reelected on the promise he kept us out of war. And so in January, she and the other women from her group had begun picketing the White House. It was the first time anybody had ever done this before. They were called silent sentinels because they didn't say a word. They just stood there with their banners and their signs. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Initially, some people admired it. Many people thought it was pretty foolish or misguided, but it was generally tolerated and ignored. People brought hot cocoa and warm bricks for these women to be standing on in January. But after the declaration of war, the mood changed dramatically. Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, they took no official stance on war work, left it up to the individuals in her group, but she refused to stop picketing, and that was very controversial. They pointed out President Wilson's hypocrisy, that he said we'd gone to war for democracy, but he was denying it to 51% of the people at home. But it was very controversial. Even Harriet Stanton Blatch, who had suggested the idea of silent sentinels to to Alice Paul, said, we can't do this at a time of war, and she resigned. And the general, many of the leadership in the national organization, National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA, thought that it was a very unwise, unpatriotic, and unprofitable thing to do. As for me, I knew and really liked people in both groups, and so I tried to stay officially deaf and dumb and not support one or the other. But the mood toward dissent was changing very quickly. George Creel and his U.S. Committee on Public Information was whipping up patriotism, and it was very clear that you were unpatriotic if you didn't volunteer, donate, do your part. And soon the Espionage and Sedition Acts would make speaking out against the war illegal, punishable by fines or imprisonment. And you can see how the mood is changing. In 1915, 650,000 copies were sold of I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier. By 1917, it was over there, over there. And as the year goes on, the rhetoric on the National Women's Party banners escalates, and up to and including Kaiser Wilson, pointing out that Germany has given their women the right to vote, has granted their women the right to vote, but we haven't been able to get it here. And what starts happening is that people start tearing at the banners and at the clothes and at the hair and screaming at the women, tripping them, etc. And instead of the police arresting the harassers, they arrest the women. And they are sent to the Occoquan workhouse, and the conditions there are appalling. And after they appeal to be treated as political prisoners, they're beaten, they're placed in solitary confinement. On what charge? Obstructing sidewalk traffic. There are about 6 of them standing there. 500 people may be attacking them, but they're the ones who are obstructing the traffic. In any event, however, the plight of these prisoners may have softened the hearts and minds of some of my fellow members of Congress, because in September of 1917, I take the chair of the Senate Suffrage Committee on a visit to the prison to visit these prisoners, and the following day, that committee finally moves the suffrage bill out of committee to the full Senate. And I'd already managed to maneuver the House bill into a committee that was friendly toward its passage as well. So for the first time in 40 years, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, as it was nicknamed, would be coming up for consideration on the floor of both houses of Congress when we returned in January of 1918. Meanwhile, Alice Paul is given solitary confinement in the mental ward. She and many other National Women's Party prisoners are cruelly force-fed, and they're not allowed visitors or messages, and this is an incredibly important film you can watch to learn about their plight. On November 15th, 1917, there was the Night of Terror. Lucy Byrne and others were actually hung by their wrists from their jailhouse doors. Another woman was thrown, a 60-year-old woman was thrown across her cell and had a concussion. It was very, very terrible. But the newspapers got smuggled accounts of what went on, and a public outcry ensued. And the speakers on behalf of the National Women's Party were getting greater crowds. And a couple of weeks later, the administration was forced to capitulate. Right after Thanksgiving, the government released Alice Paul and 20 other prisoners. It almost had to, because if one of these women, they were going on hunger strike, they were being forcibly fed, but if one of these women died in prison, the publicity against it would have been very difficult to handle. And 4 months later, in March, the court would overturn their convictions, saying that the merely assembling is not unlawful unless it's for an unlawful purpose. And that is why you can petition, you can carry banners, sing, protest in public right there in front of the White House because of what the suffrage prisoners underwent for you. Meanwhile, the National American Women's Suffrage Association was busy on a number of state campaigns around the country, trying to get presidential suffrage in a number of states, and working especially on the big one, the eyes on the prize, New York. They were furiously cultivating votes, going from door to door, explaining how suffrage had been won in so many other places. Harriet Stanton Blatch used war phrases. American women have begun to go over the top. When men go a-warring, women go to work. And she pointed out, and National pointed out that women were answering the call and doing all of these different things for the country. They only asked for enfranchisement, the vote. Political cartoonists were into the act as well. One of the big arguments against women having suffrage was that they couldn't be soldiers. And so one of the cartoonists pointed out, a woman named Lou Rogers pointed out, the soldiers saying, "But madame, you can't bear arms. Sir, you can't bear armies." And our friend Alice Dewar Miller wrote in the newspapers why we oppose votes for men, pointing out all these different things, and then stating, because men are too emotional to vote. Their conduct at baseball games and political conventions shows this, while their innate tendency to appeal to force renders them particularly unfit for the task of government. Suffragists quoted Wilson's own words, where he was calling for democracy for men and women. We're fighting for that very thing. There was a huge parade in New York for suffrage in October with more than 1 million petition signatures, and women nurses and women factory workers and so forth, women showing how patriotic they were buying the Liberty bonds, and pointing out that Wilson was endorsing state suffrage. And all of this ended up in success. Finally, an eastern state, New York, won equal suffrage in their campaign on November 6, 1917. And it was a year of great celebration because 6 Midwest states had also gotten electoral college suffrage. And so when Congress reconvened in January, politicians knew that women would have political power. Then New York plus the 11 western states plus Alaska, the territory, a quarter of the women in the country would be voting in the 1918 elections and even more in the 1920 presidential elections. Republicans were climbing on board, including myself, of course, that was my party. Democrats couldn't afford to be left behind. And so on January 9th, 1918, a year to the day that Alice Paul began her Silent Sentinels protest outside the White House, President Wilson met with a number of the leaders of the Democrats and told them that he had changed his tone, his mind, and he would be advocating for the federal amendment. It was nicknamed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment because it had gone so many years that we had gone past the 16th Amendment and the 17th Amendment and so forth. He called it an act of right and justice to the women of the country and the world. Women in our other democracies were getting the vote, England, Canada, and Russia, and he would publicly endorse it the next day. And so on January 10th, the 40th anniversary of the first attempt at the 16th Amendment, long before dawn, women lined up to get into the visitors gallery. They weren't allowed to bring in their knitting bags. Everybody was knitting, of course, for the troops. And but people said that those knitting needles might be dangerous weapons, echoes of something you probably know. In any event, a mound of bags started piling up toward the ceiling. And then President Wilson addressed the House and said, "We've made partners of women in this war. We owe it to them to give them the vote." And I was given the honor of acting as the floor leader for the Republicans, and I used the war as a touchstone for justice, saying, the boys at the front know something about democracy. They voted 2-for-1, those New York absentee ballots from the New York soldiers, in favor of women's suffrage. And I also spoke about women's work in the war. And I was very gratified when a Tennessee congressman used my very presence in that chamber as evidence that women were valuable and could be smart politically. But unfortunately, neither my speech nor the president's swayed any Southern Democrats. They were adamantly opposed to women's suffrage because they figured it would enfranchise more people, and they were very much against African American suffrage. But we had massive lobbying by both the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA, and by the National Women's Party of Alice Paul, as well as heroics. 2 congressmen climbed out of their hospital beds to vote. One left his dying wife in New York, came to vote, and then went back to bury her. And Fiorello LaGuardia actually cabled his vote. He was a soldier in Italy. And The vote passed the House, the amendment passed the House exactly the 2/3 it needed, not a vote to spare, and suffragists cheered and roared in the galleries. But the Senate was not there yet. In fact, it was, by the suffrage count, 11 votes short. There were telegrams, editorials, massive lobbying. 10 senators died. It was a very bad year to be a senator, and 7 of them, unfortunately, were suffrage supporters, and many of them were replaced by antis. The president refused to do any more for the suffrage movement. He refused to meet with a delegation of munitions workers, which infuriated Alice Paul. And so she resumed protest, and they were arrested, treated barbarically, and sent to jail. Finally, the Senate did schedule a vote for the end of September, and despite a speech by President Wilson, it failed by 2 votes. In the lame duck session, there was another attempt to pass the amendment in the Senate, but it didn't pass either, and the National Women's Party started burning Wilson's words. They said they're empty promises. You speak a good speech, but you're not arm twisting your senators. And again, they were arrested, charged with lighting fires after sundown. Imagine that. But nothing happened. All that lobbying, all the protests, nothing happened, and it was defeated by a single vote. Ironically, the New Jersey replacement senator had replaced a pro with an anti, so had that not happened, we would have passed that in Congress in the 65th session. However, when the 66th Congress convened, the suffrage vote in the elections, the 1918 elections, a quarter of the country, made a difference. There were a lot of more favorable politicians toward the idea. And it easily passed the House. Now the Senate, it was still pretty close, and the antis used everything in their power to delay its passage because they wanted to make it hard for it to get through ratification. But finally, on June 4th, 1919, it did go to vote in the Senate, and it passed. But when the amendment was finally adopted, I was not in the Congress. And ironically, it was not because of my war vote or my suffrage advocacy. It was because of my work on labor rights. I had backed up the miners and the powerful people in Montana were the mine owners who also controlled the newspapers, so I couldn't get much coverage. And so I went campaigning around the state, and that ground to a complete halt with the arrival of what you call the Spanish flu. Meetings were banned. No groups larger than 10 people could meet. And then, to add insult to injury, we had a blizzard on election day, and women just couldn't get to the polls. And so I did not get reelected. Actually, had gone. My House seat had been redistricted. I'd been trying for the Senate, but I was defeated. In any event, the suffrage battle was not over yet. 36, 3/4 of the then 48 states had to be convinced to ratify the legislatures, and many governors were reluctant to call these legislatures into special session. It ended up being a 14-month state-by-state struggle. And then, toward the end, we had 3 surprise defeats in Delaware, Connecticut, and Vermont. And we knew that most of the South was a lost cause because of the issue of race. So the eyes of the country were on Tennessee, which was really the only hope. And 56 groups, pro and anti groups, descended on the Tennessee legislature in August. The Senate easily ratified it, 25-4. But in the House, there was debate, delay, and every day more members of that chamber were wearing red roses instead of the yellow roses. Again, the yellow was supporting suffrage. There was a lot of graft, a lot of corruption, money passing hands left, right, and center. And the 8th floor of the building where they were staying, the legislators were staying, was filled with, was nicknamed, let's just say, the Jack Daniels suite. And the legislators were going around sloshed. Finally, it came to a vote, and when that vote was made, it looked like it would be a tie, and a tie would mean defeat for the amendment. And then when the roll call was made, the youngest member of the House, a man named Harry Byrne, he voted aye. And it passed. Everybody was hysterical. It was so exciting. But apparently he was afraid he was going to be beaten up. He escaped out the window and fled to the attic to hide after the vote. And it was only a little while later, a couple of days later, that we discovered what had changed his mind. And he said it was a note that he'd received that morning from his mother, which said, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratifications. Vote for suffrage and don't leave them in doubt." He voted, and women's suffrage would be the law of the land. Women were screaming, waving banners, and weeping. And on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially adopted. It had been 72 years since Seneca Falls, 144 years since Abigail Adams. And only one member of the original convention at Seneca Falls, a woman named Charlotte Woodward, was alive to see that. There was a woman from the very first national convention, Reverend Antoinette Brown Blackwell. She actually did get to vote in Elizabeth, New Jersey. In any event, after 72 years, women had the right to vote across the country. Or I should say, white women had the right to vote, because Native Americans weren't even considered citizens until 1924, and various states kept them from voting until the early 1960s in the case of New Mexico. Chinese Americans were denied suffrage until 1943, Japanese Americans till 1952, and southern states used literacy tests and various other barriers and intimidation to effectively prevent their black citizens, male and female, from voting until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which sadly was recently eviscerated by the Supreme Court. In Washington, Alice Paul stitched the 36th star on her ratification banner and draped it over the balcony at their headquarters. Incidentally, nobody knows where that banner is, so if you ever find it or hear of it in an attic, please let people know. In any event, there's a great debate about what finally won the vote for women. Was it the Pickets from the National Women's Party? Was it the persistence of the National American Women's Suffrage Association? Was it political calculus, the politicians realizing that a lot of women had the vote and would punish them if they didn't? Was it the expediency of a president who really wanted to get on with his 14 points of peace, his League of Nations plan? Was it the difficulty of denying suffrage at a time of war when women had really stepped up? All of these are justifications that have been brought to bear. There was one other that the New York Times, which at the time was not a liberal paper and was not a fan of suffrage, but in March of 1913, it ran a story on the National Women's Party's card file, and it concluded it wasn't the demonstrations, deputations, petitions, and electioneering that had turned the tide, but the triumph of an index. It credited the National Party, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, for its sagacity and habitual moderation, but said that the National Women's Party was bolder, more original, and implacable. In the hands of determined women, a good card file is better than pen or sword. So, in any event, and of course, what's in that file? The mothers of the politicians, including the Tennessee mom who made the difference. In any event, in a book written in 1923 by Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Rogers Schulers, they wrote, "Hundreds of women gave the accumulated possibilities of an entire lifetime. Thousands gave years of their lives. Hundreds of thousands gave constant interest and such aid as they could. Young suffragists who helped forge the last links of that chain were not born when it began. Old suffragists who forged the first links were dead when it ended. It is doubtful if any man, even among suffrage men, ever realized what the suffrage struggle came to mean to women before the end was allowed in America." Carrie Chapman Catt went on to found the League of Women Voters and spent the rest of her life working for peace. Alice Paul became a lawyer, a lifetime advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment, which she introduced in 1923, lobbyist for various women's rights legislation, and also an international peace activist, and she rescued a number of people in Europe at the beginning of World War II. As for me, I spent the next few years lobbying for women's and children's legislation that I had sought to pass while I was in Congress, especially that Maternity and Infancy Act that I was so passionate about. And then I spent the rest of my life working for world peace. I said we are all human beings and we have to live on this earth and we have to find a way of settling our disputes without force or violence. At age 87, I marched with 5,000 other people down the streets of Washington, D.C. as what got called the Jeanette Rankin Brigade against the Vietnam War. And at age 91, it was so gratifying when in February of 1972, the National Organization for Women gave me the very first Susan B. Anthony Award. I said I worked for suffrage for years, and I got it. I worked for peace for 55 years, and I haven't come close. I also stated that what one decides to do in a crisis depends on one's philosophy of life, and that philosophy cannot be changed by an incident. If one hasn't any philosophy in crises, others make the decision. I may be the first woman member of Congress, but I won't be the last. And if I had my life to live over, I would do it all again, but this time I would be nastier. So people call me the original nasty woman. In 1916, I predicted we would have a woman president someday and told the boys in the high school audience I was addressing not to worry, they could be the husband of the president. But sadly, we haven't had that yet. We have, as of 2019, we've had 358 women serving in Congress versus nearly 12,000 men, so we have a lot of catch-up to do. And even in the current Congress, we are less than 25%, less than 24% of the voting members. You can see that we are starting to make a difference. There are some colorful women there, both in clothing and in racial diversity. You can see it even better here, and you can see a real contrast between the parties. The Republicans elected one woman in the night, freshman woman, and you can see the Democrats are far more diverse. And the Democratic Party in Congress is now over 37%, and the Republicans are now under 10%. And it's the similar numbers that you see on the state level and on the in the cabinet and so forth. And you can see we lag behind most of the rest of the world by quite a bit as well. And what we're telling our children doesn't help. These are real September 2016 issues of girls' life and boys' life. I read it to you without any further commentary. You can see on this map right here, when women across the world got the vote, you can see we do better than some parts of the world, not as well as others. And you can see also in the United States how long it took for some of the states to ratify. The green ones all ratified before were part of the 1920 36. But the last state didn't end up ratifying the right for women to vote. That was Mississippi until 1984, believe it or not, our lifetimes. I want to also tell you about a couple of other things. I have a book. It's called Remembering the Ladies, From Patriots and Petticoats to Presidential Candidates. I call it not just a coloring book. It has a coloring page for each woman, but also a full page of information, fascinating factoids, quotable quotes. Once we get out of here and you can go visiting again, it tells you if there's a museum dedicated to the woman and gives you a bibliography of other books you might want to read on each person. 69 women of all creeds and colors are represented there, and you can read it. If you go to my website, tellingherstories.com, there's a downloadable copy that you can read there, or you can go to your favorite online bookstore and buy a paper copy. I have a presentation called Remembering the Ladies, based on that book, which goes over 240 years of American political history with women in 60 minutes, and you can look at that online, and also a look at New Jersey's unique role. It's an overlooked role in the fight for women's suffrage. Many of the people we associate with the national movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, Alice Paul, Antoinette Brown Blackwell, and many others were active in New Jersey for over a decade, and in many cases really got their political ground their political teeth there, or sharpened their political teeth there. So I also invite you to see that one, which I will post online as well. I have some other programs as well. You can find more information about them all on my website, tellingherstories.com. So I want to finish with one more quote by Alice Duer Miller from her collection, Are Women People? A Book of Rhymes for Suffrage Times, which was written in 1915 and is widely available on the web. You can find it. And this is what it says. Mother, what is a feminist? A feminist, my daughter, is any woman now who cares to think about her own affairs, as men don't think she oughter. Father, what is a legislature? A representative body elected by the people of the state. Are women people? No, my son, criminals, lunatics, and women are not people. Because, of course, if people elect representatives and women can't vote, they are not people. So I want to thank you so much for inviting me here into your living room or wherever you're watching this. And I hope that you will also get in touch with me if you have any questions or any other things you would like to follow further. So thanks again for being with me. And I will leave on the screen one more last poem by Alice Duer Miller that you can pause your screen if you want to read. So thanks so much for being with me today. So, and the other thing, while we're on the web, I am going to be doing a program, a question and answer online in a little over a week. And if you would like to join us, look at the information below my video and it will tell you how to click into that. Thank you so very much.